2. Workers' political strikes and demonstrations. Growth of the revolutionary movement among the peasants. Revolt on the battleship, Potemkin. After January 9, the revolutionary struggle of the workers grew more acute and assumed a political character. The workers began to pass from economic strikes and sympathy strikes to political strikes, to demonstrations, and in places to armed resistance to the Tsarist troops. Particularly stubborn and well-organized were the strikes in the big cities such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, Warsaw, Riga and Baku, where large numbers of workers were concentrated. The metal workers marched in the front ranks of the fighting proletariat. By their strikes, the vanguard of the workers stirred up the less class-conscious sections and roused the whole working class to the struggle. The influence of the Social Democrats grew rapidly. The May Day demonstrations in a number of towns were marked by clashes with police and troops. In Warsaw, the demonstration was fired upon and several hundred persons were killed or wounded. At the call of the Polish Social Democrats, the workers replied to the shooting in Warsaw by a general protest strike. Strikes and demonstrations did not cease throughout the month of May. In that month over 200,000 workers went on strike throughout Russia. General strikes broke out in Baku, Lodz and Ivanovo-Voznesensk. More and more frequently the strikers and demonstrators clashed with the Tsarist troops. Such clashes took place in a number of cities: Odessa, Warsaw, Riga, Lodz and others. Particularly acute was the struggle in Lodz, a large Polish industrial center. The workers erected scores of barricades in the streets of Lodz and for 3 days, June 20–24, 1905, battled in the streets against the Tsarist troops. Here armed action merged with a general strike. Lenin regarded these battles as the first armed action of the workers in Russia. The outstanding strike that summer was that of the workers of Ivanovo-Voznesensk. It lasted for about 2.5 months, from the end of May to the beginning of August 1905. About 70,000 workers, among them many women, took part in the strike. It was led by the Bolshevik Northern Committee. Thousands of workers gathered almost daily outside the city on the banks of the river Taka. At these meetings they discussed their needs. The workers' meetings were addressed by Bolsheviks. In order to crush the strike, the Tsarist authorities ordered the troops to disperse the workers and to fire upon them. Several scores of workers were killed and several hundred wounded. A state of emergency was proclaimed in the city. But the workers remained firm and would not return to work. They and their families starved, but would not surrender. It was only extreme exhaustion that in the end compelled them to return to work. The strike steeled the workers. It was an example of the courage, staunchness, endurance and solidarity of the working class. It was a real political education for the workers of Ivanovo-Voznesensk. During the strike, the workers of Ivanovo-Voznesensk set up a council of representatives, which was actually one of the first Soviets of workers' deputies in Russia. The workers' political strikes stirred up the whole country. Following the town, the countryside began to rise. In the spring, peasant unrest broke out. The peasants marched in great crowds against the landlords, raided their estates, sugar refineries and distilleries, and set fire to their palaces and manors. In a number of places the peasants seized the land, resorted to wholesale cutting down of forests, and demanded that the landed estates be turned over to the people. They seized the landlord's stores of grain and other products and divided them among the starving. The landlords fled in panic to the towns. The Tsarist government dispatched soldiers and Cossacks to crush the peasants' revolts. The troops fired on the peasants, arrested the ringleaders and flogged and tortured them. But the peasants would not cease their struggle. The peasant movement spread ever wider in the central parts of Russia, the Volga region, and in Transcaucasia, especially in Georgia. The Social Democrats penetrated deeper into the countryside. The Central Committee of the party issued an appeal to the peasants entitled, "To you, peasants, we address our word. The Social Democratic committees in the Tver, Saratov, Poltava, Chernigov, Yekaterinouslov, Tiflis and many other provinces issued appeals to the peasants. In the villages, the Social Democrats would arrange meetings, organize circles among the peasants, and set up peasant committees. In the summer of 1905, strikes of agricultural laborers, organized by Social Democrats, occurred in many places. But this was only the beginning of the peasant struggle. The peasant movement affected only 85 uezds, districts, or roughly 1/7 of the total number of uezds in the European part of Tsarist Russia. The movement of the workers and peasants and the series of reverses suffered by the Russian troops in the Russo-Japanese War had its influence on the armed forces. This bulwark of Tsardom began to totter. In June 1905, a revolt broke out on the Potemkin, a battleship of the Black Sea Fleet. The battleship was at that time stationed near Odessa, where a general strike of the workers was in progress. The insurgent sailors wreaked vengeance on their more detested officers and brought the vessel to Odessa. The battleship Potemkin had gone over to the side of the revolution. Lenin attributed immense importance to this revolt. He considered it necessary for the Bolsheviks to assume the leadership of this movement and to link it up with the movement of the workers, peasants and the local garrisons. The Tsar dispatched several warships against the Potemkin, but the sailors of these vessels refused to fire on their insurgent comrades. For several days the red ensign of revolution waved from the mast of the battleship Potemkin. But at that time, in 1905, the Bolshevik Party was not the only party leading the movement, as was the case later, in 1917. There were quite a number of Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries and anarchists on board the Potemkin. Consequently, although individual Social Democrats took part in the revolt, it lacked proper and sufficiently experienced leadership. At decisive moments part of the sailors wavered. The other vessels of the Black Sea Fleet did not join the revolt of the Potemkin. Having run short of coal and provisions, the revolutionary battleship was compelled to make for the Romanian shore and there surrender to the authorities. The revolt of the sailors on the battleship Potemkin ended in defeat. The sailors who subsequently fell into the hands of the Tsarist government were committed for trial. Some were executed and others condemned to exile and penal servitude. But the revolt in itself was an event of the utmost importance. The Potemkin revolt was the first instance of mass revolutionary action in the army and navy, the first occasion on which a large unit of the armed forces of the Tsar sided with the revolution. This revolt made the idea of the army and navy joining forces with the working class, the people, more comprehensible to and nearer to the heart of the workers and peasants, and especially of the soldiers and sailors themselves. The workers' recourse to mass political strikes and demonstrations, the growth of the peasant movement, the armed clashes between the people and the police and troops, and, finally, the revolt in the Black Sea Fleet, all went to show that conditions were ripening for an armed uprising of the people. This stirred the liberal bourgeoisie into action. Fearing the revolution, and at the same time frightening the Tsar with the specter of revolution, it sought to come to terms with the Tsar against the revolution. It demanded slight reforms for the people so as to pacify the people, to split the forces of the revolution and thus avert the horrors of revolution. "Better part with some of our land than part with our heads," said the liberal landlords. The liberal bourgeoisie was preparing to share power with the Tsar. The proletariat is fighting. The bourgeoisie is stealing towards power, Lenin wrote in those days in reference to the tactics of the working class and the tactics of the liberal bourgeoisie. The Tsarist government continued to suppress the workers and peasants with brutal ferocity. But it could not help seeing that it would never cope with the revolution by repressive measures alone. Therefore, without abandoning measures of repression, it resorted to a policy of maneuvering. On the one hand, with the help of its agents provocateurs, it incited the peoples of Russia against each other, engineering Jewish pogroms and mutual massacres of Armenians and Tatars. On the other hand, it promised to convene a representative institution in the shape of a Zemsky Sobor or a State Duma, and instructed the minister Bulagin to draw up a project for such a Duma, stipulating, however, that it was to have no legislative powers. All these measures were adopted in order to split the forces of revolution and to sever from it the moderate sections of the people. The Bolsheviks declared a boycott of the Bulagin Duma with the aim of frustrating this travesty of popular representation. The Mensheviks, on the other hand, decided not to sabotage the Duma and considered it necessary to take part in it. 3. Tactical differences between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Third Party Congress. LENIN''S's, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. Tactical Foundations of the Marxist Party. The revolution had set in motion all classes of society. The turn in the political life of the country caused by the revolution dislodged them from their old wanted positions and compelled them to regroup themselves in conformity with the new situation. Each class and each party endeavored to work out its tactics, its line of conduct, its attitude towards other classes, and its attitude towards the government. Even the Tsarist government found itself compelled to devise new and unaccustomed tactics, as instanced by the promise to convene a representative institution, the Bulagin Duma. The Social Democratic Party, too, had to work out its tactics. This was dictated by the growing tide of the revolution. It was dictated by the practical questions that faced the proletariat and brooked no delay: organization of armed uprising, overthrow of the Tsarist government, creation of a provisional revolutionary government, participation of the Social Democrats in this government, attitude towards the peasantry and towards the liberal bourgeoisie, etc. The Social Democrats had to work out for themselves carefully considered and uniform Marxist tactics. But owing to the opportunism of the Mensheviks and their splitting activities, the Russian Social Democratic Party was at that time divided into two groups. The split could not yet be considered complete, and formally the two groups were not yet two separate parties, but in reality they very much resembled two separate parties, each with its own leading center and its own press. What helped to widen the split was the fact that to their old differences with the majority of the party over organizational questions, the Mensheviks added new differences over tactical questions. The absence of a united party resulted in the absence of uniform party tactics. A way out of the situation may have been found by immediately summoning another Congress, the Third Congress of the party, establishing common tactics and binding the minority to carry out in good faith the decisions of the Congress, the decisions of the majority. This was what the Bolsheviks proposed to the Mensheviks. But the Mensheviks would not hear of summoning the Third Congress, considering it a crime to leave the party any longer without tactics endorsed by the party and binding upon all party members. The Bolsheviks decided to take the initiative of convening the Third Congress into their own hands. All the party organizations, both Bolshevik and Menshevik, were invited to the Congress. But the Mensheviks refused to take part in the Third Congress and decided to hold one of their own. As the number of delegates at their Congress proved to be small, they called it a conference, but actually it was a Congress, a Menshevik Party Congress, whose decisions were considered binding on all Mensheviks. The Third Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Party met in London in April 1905. It was attended by 24 delegates representing 20 Bolshevik committees. All the large organizations of the party were represented. The Congress condemned the Mensheviks as a section that had split away from the party and passed on to the business on hand, the working out of the tactics of the party. At the same time that this Congress was held, the Mensheviks held their conference in Geneva. Two Congresses, two parties, was the way Lenin summed up the situation. Both the Congress and the conference virtually discussed the same tactical questions, but the decisions they arrived at were diametrically opposite. The two sets of resolutions adopted by the Congress and the Conference respectively revealed the whole depth of the tactical difference between the Third Party Congress and the Menshevik Conference, between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Here are the main points of these differences. Tactical line of the Third Party Congress. The Congress held that despite the bourgeois democratic character of the revolution in progress, despite the fact that it could not at the given moment go beyond the limits of what was possible within the framework of capitalism, it was primarily the proletariat that was interested in its complete victory, for the victory of this revolution would enable the proletariat to organize itself, to grow politically, to acquire experience and competence in political leadership of the toiling masses, and to proceed from the bourgeois revolution to the socialist revolution. Tactics of the proletariat designed to achieve the complete victory of the bourgeois democratic revolution could find support only in the peasantry, for the latter could not settle scores with the landlords and obtain possession of their lands without the complete victory of the revolution. The peasantry was therefore the natural ally of the proletariat. The liberal bourgeoisie was not interested in the complete victory of this revolution, for it needed the Tsarist regime as a whip against the workers and peasants, whom it feared more than anything else, and it would strive to preserve the Tsarist regime, only somewhat restricting its powers. The liberal bourgeoisie would therefore attempt to end matters by coming to terms with the Tsar on the basis of a constitutional monarchy. The revolution would win only if headed by the proletariat. If the proletariat, as the leader of the revolution, secured an alliance with the peasantry, if the liberal bourgeoisie were isolated, if the Social Democratic Party took an active part in the organization of the uprising of the people against Tsardom, if, as the result of a successful uprising, a provisional revolutionary government were set up that would be capable of destroying the counter-revolution root and branch and convening a constituent assembly representing the whole people, and if the Social Democratic Party did not refuse, the circumstances being favorable, to take part in the provisional revolutionary government in order to carry the revolution to its conclusion. Tactical line of the Menshevik Conference. Inasmuch as the revolution was a bourgeois revolution, only the liberal bourgeoisie could be its leader. The proletariat should not establish close relations with the peasantry, but with the liberal bourgeoisie. The chief thing was not to frighten off the liberal bourgeoisie by a display of revolutionary spirit and not to give it a pretext to recoil from the revolution, for if it were to recoil from the revolution would be weakened. It was possible that the uprising would prove victorious, but after the triumph of the uprising the Social Democratic Party should step aside so as not to frighten away the liberal bourgeoisie. It was possible that as a result of the uprising a provisional revolutionary government would be set up, but the Social Democratic Party should under no circumstances take part in it, because this government would not be socialist in character, and because, and this was the chief thing, by its participation in this government and by its revolutionary spirit, the Social Democratic Party might frighten off the liberal bourgeoisie and thus undermine the revolution. It would be better for the prospects of the revolution if some sort of a representative institution were convened, of the nature of a Zemsky Sabor or a State Duma, which could be subjected to the pressure of the working class from without so as to transform it into a constituent assembly or impel it to convene a constituent assembly. The proletariat had its own specific, purely wage worker interests, and it should attend to these interests only and not try to become the leader of the bourgeois revolution, which, being a general political revolution, concerned all class and not the proletariat alone. Such, in brief, were the two tactics of the two groups of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party.